be coming in, but Nasim, if you could start the recording, please. Thank you.
Yes, recorded. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording the event, so if you don't have your camera on or anything, feel free to take that on.
Yes, please. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so excited to have the Congressman with us. The event today is hosted by the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association along with LALSA and BLSA, and this is in conjunction with the DMV APALSA's coalition that we've started this past year. We're very excited to be working with the other APALSA chapters in the area, and we hope to continue to have amazing events like we're having today. And we really appreciate that the Congressman is here with us to talk about such prevalent issues. Now handing it to Nasim to continue the event.
So like Nikita said, our speaker today is Congressman Michael F.Q. Nicolas from the beautiful island of Guam. Before we get into further introductions, I'd just like, again, to remind anyone, because people are shuffling in, that we're recording the event. And in the course of the presentation, if you have any questions, to feel free to private message them to me. And then that way, at the end of the event, I can go ahead and moderate those questions alongside Nikita. So that being said, just to share a quick background on Guam. Guam's a U.S. territory in the Pacific, 7.5-hour westward flight past Hawaii. The residents of Guam are American citizens by birth. Indigenous Guamanians are the Chamorros, who are related to the Austronesian peoples of Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Guam's population is approximately 169,000 as of 2021. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our 1L rep, Herman Pablo, to introduce the Congressman.
So about the Congressman, Mr. Nicolas successfully served 3 terms as a former senator in the Guam legislature before being elected as a delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives for Guam's at-large congressional district. Congressman Nicolas currently serves on numerous House committees and subcommittees, including the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services as the Vice Chairman, the Committee on Natural Resources, the Financial Services Subcommittee, the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee, the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy Subcommittee, the Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions Subcommittee, the Indigenous Peoples of the United States Subcommittee, and the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. The Congressman is also a member of numerous caucuses, including the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the Congressional Autism Caucus, the Congressional U.S.-Philippines Friendship Caucus, the Congressional Caucus on Korea, the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, the U.S.-Japan Congressional Caucus, the Future Forum Caucus, the Pacific Islands Caucus, and the Historically Black Colleges and University, HBCU Caucus. All this is to say that the Congressman provides very impressive support and leadership within broad and diverse areas of public interest. We would now like to extend a warm Hafa Day greeting and Sidzu Ma'asi, thank you, to Congressman Nicolas for his generous support, for his generous and continued support for education. And with that, we would now like to turn the meeting over to the Congressman for his presentation and discussion.
Well, half a day. Let me begin first by thanking you, Herman, for initiating this this very delightful Zoom conference. I'm very, very happy to be here. Nasim and Nikita, thank you so much for moderating us here today. And thank you to the Asia Pacific American Law Students Association, the Black Law Students Association, and the Latin American Law Association also for all of your hard work to make this possible. As I was sharing with Herman as we were having our pre-meeting before coming onto this, I'm not really a speech kind of guy. If I have to, I will, but I know that we actually have a lot of students who are participating in this call, and I would prefer to just kind of make it very light and very Q&A based, and then from there allow for the conversations to develop and also for follow-up questions. I just wanted to make myself available to be able to contribute to all of the work that you're doing and to support you in any way that I can in making myself present for you here today. So thank you all very much, and we can go ahead and begin whenever you're ready.
And yeah, so we can go ahead and dive into the first question. So the first question that we had was, please provide your perspective of the economic challenges facing the people of Guam and any similarities you may see with other mainland communities.
Well, Guam being so far away, we have our own unique set of challenges. Some of them might not necessarily translate well into the mainland United States. I can say that one of the things that we do find a lot of commonality in is with rural communities across the country. Because of our semi-isolated circumstances, a lot of rural communities also kind of suffer the same circumstances we do. For example, access to banking in our district. We do have bank establishments on Guam, but we don't have any of the major banks. We don't have Bank of America. We don't have Citigroup. We don't have Wells Fargo. And so that's a common thread that you'll actually find throughout rural America. The underbanked and the unbanked having difficulty in being able to access the full gamut of financial services that you can find in more heavily populated metropolitan areas. Some of the other challenges we have on Guam relative to our location economically is, of course, being able to bring goods and services out to the territory when we have a need for them. And so we only have 2 shipping providers to Guam right now, Matson and American President Lines. And so the Jones Act does present a lot of challenges for us to be able to avail of our unique position as a crossroads in the Pacific. We have many carriers, international carriers, leaving the port of Los Angeles, but the Jones Act prohibits goods being shipped between U.S. ports unless they are on U.S. flagships, built in U.S. shipyards, and manned by U.S. citizen crews. And so we can have large Chinese, Taiwan, Korean ships, Australian ships, Philippine ships traversing the Pacific, and it would make perfect sense for them to be able to bring goods from the port of Los Angeles and just do a stopover for us, bringing our shipping costs down dramatically. But unfortunately, because of the Jones Act, we're unable to do that. I know that's a common area where there's concern, not only on the West Coast of the United States, but the East Coast, as well as other territories like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And so that's another policy area, but it's also a complicated policy area because that particular legislation does have a lot of support with labor unions throughout the West Coast who find their circumstances are a lot more robust when you have that restriction because, the requirement for U.S. citizen crews, U.S. flagships, and U.S. flags does provide a protection, excuse me, a protection for their circumstances. So, those are some of the political challenges on the Jones Act that we have to contend with. I know Hawaii also shares some similar challenges as well. If we could somehow get exemptions to the Jones Act, or if we could revisit the Jones Act altogether entirely, that would dramatically improve our ability to procure goods and services at a much lower cost basis. Some of our other challenges that we have on Guam is, national policy. When we move things out for the country and the Congress, they don't really take into consideration how it's going to impact us on a unique basis. And so part of our work in the Congress that we've been really focusing our energies on is just bringing the territories to the table and making sure that our unique circumstances are taken into consideration when policy is being developed. And we've been very successful in doing so with these latest relief packages that we've been dealing with on COVID-19. Guam has been severely impacted. We are primarily a tourism-driven economy. And so with COVID-19, with the airlines shutting down and everything kind of closing up, our tourism has dropped from pushing up to 2 million tourists a year to barely over 40,000. So we've had a dramatic reduction in tourism as a result of COVID-19. And so those are some of the challenges that we're facing in the present day. And the relief packages that we were able to put together in the Congress, I really need to do a shout out to our leadership, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, they've been phenomenal in making sure that the territorial conversation was absolutely brought up in the development of all of these packages. We've not only succeeded in getting Guam included in all the package language, but we also succeeded in being able to have specific areas of concern relative to our territory addressed as these packages have moved forward. And it's been an absolute lifeline. Guam, who are 2 million tourists a year prior to COVID, we actually were receiving more tourists per capita than anywhere else in the country. 2 million tourists for 169,000 population, we are actually #1 per capita. And so when that all went away with COVID, I mean, it was absolutely devastating. And so for the past year and going into this year, it's really been the federal relief that's been sustaining the island. We were able to make sure that Guam was included in PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance that's available throughout the country. But that was incredibly significant because Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, we did not have any unemployment assistance programs in place. And so on a local level, we weren't able to respond to the unemployment crisis that was developing due to the COVID circumstances. So being able to has just been a severe lifeline for our entire community. We've had workforce on the private sector unemployed, and they have all been relying heavily on the pandemic unemployment assistance for them to be able to make ends meet. And that's just some of the economic circumstances that we're dealing with. One of the other things that we found that was just incredibly alarming was that Guam is outside of the U.S. Customs Zone, as is all of the United States territories. And so being outside of the U.S. Customs Zone does have its advantages because we are not subject to tariffs, and we are not subject to those kind of restrictions when they become a national policy. But on the flip side, when the country negotiates trade agreements, we are not included in those negotiations. And so we are closer to Asia than we are to the mainland United States, but all of the trade agreements that the United States has in place with Korea, with Taiwan, with Japan, none of those trade agreements include Guam. And so when someone wants to engage in free trade with those countries, we are charged a trading rate that is outside of what the US negotiated. And so one of the recent constituent concerns that came to my office was we had a particular company that was manufacturing a Guam labeled beer, and it was pretty popular in Korea. The manufacturing was happening in the mainland United States. A Korean purchaser wanted to order a container load of it, and we were trying to, the business was trying to drop ship it from mainland US over to Korea. But when they made the effort to do that, the Korean buyer came back and said, hey, we're actually getting assessed a tariff rate that's just not going to be feasible because it's not at the rate that we were expecting with the US trade agreement. And so those are just some of the challenges that we have. Those are some of the issues that we're tackling in the office. We're hoping that if there's going to be a second round of TPP brought back on the table with the Biden administration, that we may try and get our territories included in that negotiation. Or one of our other options is to actually capitalize on the fact that we're outside of the US Customs Zone, not part of these US trade agreements, and get clearance from the United States for us to negotiate our own trade agreements. And if we're able to do that at a more favorable negotiated rate than what the US was able to negotiate, that could actually be very substantial in Guam developing an export-oriented industry from our territory as a facilitator of exports from the United States. So those are all the different angles that we're looking at on the free trade side, and that's a pretty broad overview of some of the economic challenges that we have and the economic circumstances that we're dealing with in COVID-19.
Great, thank you. So to just deter off that a tiny bit, can you tell us a little bit about health issues that the people of Guam are being affected by? And then maybe if you can tie in a little bit about how the Affordable Care Act could improve or how it might otherwise influence that?
When the Affordable Care Act was enacted, one of the really sad things that occurred, and this was before my time, was that it was being proposed for the territories without including any of the subsidies, the federal subsidies that were going to be attached to it throughout the rest of the country. And that made it very unaffordable. It basically meant that the local government and the local tax base was going to have to absorb those federal subsidies that otherwise we would have received if we were going to be funded with them. And I believe at the time when the Affordable Care Act was being implemented and when we were being dealt that hand, it was looking like it was going to cost us about $70 million annually out of our local coffers, and our local coffers just would not be able to sustain that kind of expense. And so we were afforded the option to either participate in the Affordable Care Act or not. And so at the time, the local government, because it could not afford to absorb that cost, made the option not to participate in the Affordable Care Act. What that has resulted in is we are, I guess you could say we are an example of what would have happened if we never had the Affordable Care Act. We have insurance companies that are pretty much the primary provider of health insurance on the island. And on Guam, none of the insurance companies provide insurance for individuals. It all has to be through companies. And then a lot of these companies, they set up their insurance programs so that it's only for full-time employees. So part-time workers are uninsured. And that becomes very, very unfortunate on Guam because we have a very large, as I mentioned, tourism industry. What a lot of the hotels do is they do not hire employees on a full-time basis. So they have a very, very large part-time employee population, and they're uninsured. And if we had the Affordable Care Act, they would be insured. And so, I mean, it's just one of those very unfortunate circumstances where you have an industry that's the primary driver of the economy, but you don't have the policies in place to be able to make sure that the workers are availing of the benefits that, you know, should be coming with that industry being so, you know, pronounced. So we have, you know, these large hotels, many of them of which are foreign owned, employing our people on a part-time basis, and they are not getting health insurance. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do, and we've been working on this recently, is to try and see if, as you know, new opportunities come up for the Affordable Care Act to be revisited, any kind of tweaks, any kind of legislative opportunities that might allow for us to tag in some kind of language to extend the Affordable Care Act to the territories and do so with the federal subsidies, that will be transformative on the island. So that's something we're looking at really trying to work on. We're hoping that those windows present themselves, and we'll try and capitalize on those opportunities when they come through. Another challenge that we have on a healthcare basis was prior to us taking office, Medicaid on Guam and in territories was actually having a different level of federal support. And so across the country, Medicaid reimbursement rates, where the federal government reimburses or funds a portion of the Medicaid costs, those are based on poverty levels. But on in the territories, they were based on fixed formulas. And so while our poverty levels are similar to a state like Mississippi that has, you know, closer to 90% federal matching on Medicaid, we were stuck at 55%. And so what that was doing was it was creating a situation where the local government would need to absorb the other 45%. And again, with our coffers being so revenue challenged, that disparity in being able to have a poverty connected matching rates from the federal government was very, very damaging to our fiscal situation. Fortunately, recently, in the last Congress, we were able to get a small window through where we had our matching rates increased to about 83%, which was transformative because that really, really alleviated the local coffers from having to absorb the difference. But that was only a 2-year window. And so that 2-year window is going to be revisited in the coming years. And what we're hoping to do is, now that we've gotten our foot in the door with this reimbursement rate being increased, that we can permanize that and hopefully have it just entirely attached to the poverty levels similar to the rest of the country. But those are 2 examples of how healthcare funding on the island is so disparate because of our territorial status, and the fact that over the years, territories were not included in policy on a co-equal basis. Again, I really need to thank my leadership in the Congress for helping us to open that door on the Medicaid side recently. And I'd like to thank them also for being very, very open to dialogue about us perhaps permanizing that, and also to the committees for their willingness to entertain any language that we're trying to move through to get the federal subsidies and the Affordable Care Act revisited for our jurisdictions. But yeah, that's just that's kind of a lay of the land in terms of healthcare. And as you can imagine, I mean, coming full circle, when the resources aren't getting there, the healthcare system suffers, because when the local government is unable to make the matching funds on Medicaid, it results in slower funding being able to be put into our healthcare system, and that results in our hospitals having delayed receipts from the local government on the Medicaid side, and those delayed receipts have a compounding effect. We'll find our hospitals having slower payment times to their vendors. So when they go out and they buy medicine or they buy hospital supplies, because they're receiving payments on a slower basis because of the fiscal constraints, they're then turning around and paying their vendors more slowly. And what that does is it creates a risk profile for the vendor and hospital relationships. The vendor jacks up their price. And they say, you know what, we don't know if we're going to get paid in 15 days or 30 days. You have some receipts that are more than 90 days old. So we're going to give you risk-based pricing that's going to have your medical supplies, your medicines be more expensive because we don't know when we're going to get paid. So you can see how policy on the federal side trickles down into really creating an anaconda kind of environment that begins to strangle the healthcare system overall. Yeah, because as medicines get more expensive and supplies get more expensive, it becomes a death spiral, because we already couldn't afford it to begin with, and now it's getting even more costly. And so, and then those costs begin to flood the entire system. So those who are self-paying for care have higher medical costs because of the overall higher cost of supplies. Those who are even able to fortunately be insured by the health insurance companies are also finding their health insurance premiums going up, because the cost for the health insurance companies to be able to meet those additional risk-based pricing expenses has to get passed through to the customers. And so, oftentimes in the country, we get wrapped around, free market versus where the federal government is overstepping. But this is a classic example of how federal policy is helping to bring costs down, not only for the insurance premiums of the Affordable Care Act, but by making sure that receipts are getting paid on a more timely basis, that those who choose to still be insured are also not seeing their premiums go up because risk-based pricing is starting to drive costs higher. So, I mean, like I said, we're a microcosm of what happens if you didn't have the Affordable Care Act. And that's just an example of what the country has been able to escape with the Affordable Care Act, and what we're hoping to eventually be able to escape by being able to fully avail of that. One other item on the healthcare side is supplemental security income. The federal government years ago excluded territories from SSI. And if you're unfamiliar with SSI, that is a lifeline basically for people who are eligible, primarily those with disabilities. And that is just an incredibly tragic set of circumstances, because not only do people with disabilities, of course, have their circumstances to manage, but when you don't have a lifeline like SSI, what happens is you don't have a pool of resources going into communities to be able to not only support those who are relying on that resource, but to also provide a baseline of funding for service providers. So without SSI, there's no funds for those who need services, and there's no pool of funds to be able to pay for service providers to be able to provide their services. So on Guam, we have a serious lack in service providers being able to provide services for people with disabilities, because we don't have that baseline of resources to be able to have a method of payment that would justify those kind of businesses and those kind of services opening up and being able to provide what's needed in the community. So those are our circumstances. Those are some of the things that we're working on. SSI was actually the first bill I introduced when I got elected in the 116th. It was also the first bill I introduced in the 117th. And we were trying to have it included in this budget reconciliation package being negotiated. But we were unfortunately unable to, because there's just so many. I mean, you guys hear it, 1.9 trillion. That's too much money, and then for territories to try and come in with this other additional cost was just a little too challenging. But we are getting commitments from our colleagues that there is an interest in trying to explore this perhaps in next year's budget reconciliation, and we're hoping that we're going to be able to get support not just from our leadership, but across the country, because SSI is just a staple of American decency, and it's absolutely something that every American should be able to avail of, especially if they're living on American soil. So those are our circumstances, and I hope I didn't go into too much detail there.
No, thank you so much. That was very insightful, and we appreciate it. We actually have a question from the audience. From Professor Kelly. She's asking, how often are you able to go home to see your constituents, and how do you stay in touch from so far away?
Well, a typical member of Congress, we usually conclude business on a late Thursday evening, and then they fly out on a Friday or on a Thursday if we're able to conclude business earlier to be able to be with their constituents over the weekend, and they do fly-ins on Monday. For Guam, that is absolutely impractical. We're on the other side of the international date line. The earliest flight for me to go out will be on a Friday, which means I would arrive on a Saturday evening, and I would then already be making my arrangements to depart on a Sunday. If I wanted to get there the day before Monday, or if I leave on a Monday, the earliest flight in will probably have me come in at between 4 and 7 p.m. So I am unable to avail of the fly-ins or fly-outs the way a normal member of Congress would, because of our time zone and international dateline challenges. We do in the Congress have a schedule that pretty much has us doing business 3 weeks in DC and then 1 week in district. And so while I'm unable to go home on the weekends, I do make it back to Guam for that 1 week district period. When I first ran for Congress, I was thinking to myself, okay, I'll do the 3 weeks in DC, I'll grind it out, and then I'll go to Guam and I'll be able to kind of recover from, all the rigmarole of that huge 3 week, rush. It's almost the exact opposite, because there's so much pent up demand to see me. When I get back to Guam for that 1 week, I'm just inundated. And so, we do make time to be able to get home for our constituents. We maximize the time that's available when we are there. But, being the only member of Congress for Guam, other districts, they have multiple members for their states, for example, but being the one and only guy on Guam, anything federal, we get hit with. And so it's just an incredibly busy time. But I do want to do a shout out to my team, my Guam team. I have excellent leadership and excellent people out there who really do a fantastic job in being able to address constituent concerns. Our DC side over here, because of our time zone differences and our international dateline differences, somebody will come in with a problem on a Monday. It's Sunday out here, but our Guam people are able to send out to our DC side the issues or the concerns. And then once the sun comes up on the Monday side on DC, they're on top of it. So my staff is just extraordinary in their responses to our constituents. And we do track very, very closely what comes in, what goes out, and they've just been doing an excellent job being able to fill the gaps that I'm unable to because I'm away for 3 weeks out of the month. But yeah, that's the reality. When I do go home, it used to be a 17-hour flight. I would normally route from Dulles to Narita down to Guam, and that's about a 17-hour trek. But unfortunately, United discontinued the Dulles to Narita direct flight. So now I got to go from Dulles to Chicago, or Dulles to Newark, or Dulles to Denver, and then to Narita, and then to Guam. And so that added maybe an hour to 2 hours to my leg. So now I'm about maybe 18, 19 hours one way to get home, and one way back. So I do get a lot of sympathy points in the Congress for my commute. The members in California, they always tell me, I'm never going to complain again after hearing what you go through. So, we take it for what it's worth.
Great, thank you. And another question from the audience is asking whether you were in the Capitol on January 6th, and if so, if you'd be willing to comment about your experience that day or anything related to that.
I actually was not, and that was very, very fortunate. What happened was on that day, members of the members from the territories weren't able to vote on the floor. We are able to vote for amendments, we are able to vote in committee, but we're unable to vote on the floor. And that day was a day for only floor votes. And so I was doing my work more remotely, and I was fortunate to not be in the area. Unfortunately, a staff member of mine, who actually, Nasim and Nikita Ilidio, the one that you were working with to set this up, he had his vaccine scheduled for that day. And so he went in to the complex, and he shared with me his experiences when he was there. He was actually in the House Physician's office receiving his vaccine when things really started to escalate. They immediately, Capitol Police immediately rushed in and transformed the entire House Physician's office into a triage. And they were bringing in Capitol Police officers who were suffering injuries, and it was just just, you can't even describe the circumstances. And Eli unfortunately was right in the middle of it. He then was trying to make his way back to the office. Capitol Police immediately redirected him to a safe zone. And he was actually situated with other members of Congress who were present at the time in a secured area, and they were just kind of locked down. But yeah, based on what he was sharing with me, I was messaging him, calling him like, "Are you okay? Give me an update. Give me an update." But it got to a point also where he messaged me back and said, "Sir, I can't. We're locking down all communications. No one is supposed to know where we are or even what our circumstances are, because we don't want any of that getting out and then kind of directing those who were storming the Capitol, on where locations were or what the stress levels were." So yeah, it was, I really felt for him, but I was fortunately not on campus at the time. But I mean, to this very day, the trauma that was experienced by those who were present, and even those of us who weren't. I mean, we were sitting back just similar to the rest of the country, in absolute shock as to what was going on. My daughter, just the week before, I brought her down to work with me, and on the way in that week before, she was talking about how safe it was. And I was telling her, I said, "This is the safest place in the world, baby. You don't need to worry," And then fast forward a week later, and they're talking about it in her class. And she's coming back to me saying, "Daddy, what is this?" So it was, I think this will go down in history as perhaps one of our darkest days in the country. And we absolutely cannot discount in any way the significance of what happened, and we absolutely must learn from it and fully recognize everything that it speaks to in terms of what's wrong with America today and what we need to do to fix it.
Wow, Great, thank you. We appreciate that. We did get another question regarding, do you have any advice for law students who are interested in entering the public service realm or interested in Congress? Any advice for us?
Well, okay, yeah. So there, I always joke around. You'll find one of three people in Congress. You'll find a member, you'll find a lawyer, or you'll find a recent law student graduate who is, getting into the system. Having a law background naturally. Are you guys okay? Can you still see me and hear me?
Oh, I think it cut off for a few minutes.
Okay, there must have been some kind of technical difficulty. Having a law background absolutely is a big plus on the Hill. If you're looking at trying to get into the DC system, I would advise that you take whatever opportunity is out there and just get your foot in the door. Whether it's an internship, whether it's a fellowship, whether it's even an entry-level position, because just getting your foot in the door will immediately give you access to not only the experience, but it'll give you an opportunity to really, through your hard work, move up and move into whatever positions you might be interested in. Members of Congress are constantly looking for new talent. I'm looking for new talent. And we're looking for new talent for a lot of reasons, really. Either those who are working with us are of course moving into other positions. I know I have a staff member who is being actively recruited by the committee to work on the committee staff. And so, if that had occurred, that would of course be a vacancy that we're looking to fill in our office. But and then of course on the committee side, or even in offices, when you get a lot of experience on the Hill, everyone starts pulling at you. Whether it's the administration trying to pull you to work in their administration, whether it's nonprofit organizations trying to get you in so that you can, provide that kind of guidance, having that inside knowledge of how things work and how to move things along faster. Whether it's government agencies or think tanks or even lobbying firms. I mean, they're all trying to recruit away staff so that they can have that person who has the knowledge of how things work on a real-time basis. And so that creates a lot of attrition, and that attrition creates a lot more openings, and those openings create new opportunities for law school graduates. So if you're interested, just get your foot in the door, really. And opportunities continuously open up, and just having your foot in the door will give you the leg up to be able to take advantage of those and then begin developing that career track that you're interested in. If you're interested in running for the office, I can have a totally different conversation about that. Law degree absolutely is not necessary. It does of course give you the education credential, and but it all depends on if you get voted into office. Your constituents are the ones who need to really determine whether or not you're someone they want to have represent them. And so if you want to get elected, the first thing that you really need to do is establish that kind of credibility with your constituents. You can do that in work that you do with your law degree. You can do that in work that you do outside of your regular law profession. But establishing that credibility with your constituents would be the first step to being able to earn their trust and their support for you to seek public office. After of course, establishing that credibility, it all depends entirely on the political environment that you're in. All across the country, it's incredibly diverse. You have some areas that are a lot more conservative, some areas that are a lot more liberal. You have some areas where people want you to advocate in certain ways, and other areas where they want you to do so in different ways. So it's very, very fluid. I really can't give a specific roadmap into public office, but I can say that credibility is everything. Do not ever promise what you can't deliver, because your deliverables are going to be your track record, and your track record is going to ensure that you stay in office when you get in office, or that or that they trust you enough to be able to continue that kind of work if they were to elevate you into the position. So yeah, that's basically the two paths into DC. I can also say too that at a staff level, we have had, and it's not uncommon for staff to eventually become members of Congress. Being able to navigate the halls and figure out the different mechanics of how things work, and then also being able to just develop the networks that are critical to getting you elected. I mean, all of those things present themselves a lot more clearly when you are part of the process. So either way, whether it's through a DC career or a political career, just getting your foot in the door also could be very, very substantial.
Great, thank you. And another question from the audience says that, Congressman, I know that your bio says that your parents are longtime educators. Could you speak more about education in Guam as well as legislative issues and so forth?
Okay, yeah. Education on Guam is a challenge. It's a challenge. Even during these COVID circumstances, I brought my family out here because I absolutely did not want to be away from them for 3 weeks out of the month. And just the difference in resources, the difference in support is just it's very, very profound. One of the challenges we have on Guam, and this is a political challenge, is our property tax rate, I think, is the lowest in the country. It's like a fraction of a percent compared to the lowest property tax rate anywhere else in the United States, in the 50 states. And if you're not aware, most school systems are funded through property taxes. And that's why, when you buy a house and you're paying $400 a month in property taxes as part of your mortgage, that's going to support your school system. Because our property taxes on Guam are so low, the school system relies more on Guam on general fund revenues as opposed to property tax revenues. I believe, gosh, the general fund proportion of the public school system is maybe 80 times more than the property tax portion of the funding of the public school system on Guam. And that's a political challenge because nobody wants to raise property taxes. That's a local mandate. No one wants to be the one to raise the property taxes on the local community. I'm actually pretty surprised at how high it is out here, given how politically unpopular, you would consider some of those things to be. I think what really helps it though out here in the mainland is that everything's broken down by counties. And so the counties, those can set their property taxes. If it's too high, someone can just move to the next county. And if the electoral, if the base, the voter base is okay with them being so high because it's actually manifesting in results in the education system, then there's a satisfaction there from the voter. For example, Montgomery County, where I'm at, has a very excellent rated schools and a pretty high property tax rate. And so, if the taxes correspond to the outcomes, then the residents and the taxpayers are generally satisfied. On Guam, it's a chicken or the egg problem. Our test scores are among the lowest in the country. And so politically, it becomes so hard because, when you say you're going to raise property taxes for education, but your scores are so low, tax base says, why are you going to raise my taxes when our scores are so low? But on the flip side, the argument is, well, we can't bring the scores up if we don't have the resources. But then the whole credibility argument comes into play with government at large. Because if the government is bringing in taxes for all these other functions and things are still so dysfunctional, there's no public trust in that raising property taxes is going to actually result in the outcome of better education. And so this is I think this is an example of a lesson to be learned about outcomes overall, and credibility overall as an elected official. If you're not delivering with the resources that you have, your voter base and your tax base is not going to want to give you more resources because they're not going to trust that you're going to deliver on what your promises are. And so on Guam, education is a challenge. It's challenged predominantly by resources. We have excellent teachers, excellent teachers, but they can only do so much. And when the resources aren't there, education is just going to continue to struggle. On top of that, things tie in even further. As I mentioned earlier, with our tourism-based economy and many of those workers being part-time workers, what many of those workers end up doing is taking on multiple part-time jobs just to be able to provide for their families. What happens with that is you have families, you have parents who are working 12 hours a day, 3 different part-time jobs, because they aren't getting health insurance, they gotta pay for that out of pocket, they have children to provide for. And so when they're working 12 hours a day, you can imagine that the parental support of the students is not there. And so, those of us in education, we know that, on top of having excellent teachers, you need to have resources and you need to have parental involvement. And so when you have these kind of economic circumstances where the resources aren't there and the economy is designed in a way, unintentionally, but still designed in that way for parental involvement to suffer, then student performance is going to suffer. And when that student performance suffers, what suffers? The test scores, the outcomes. And so it's just a whole compounded problem of, it's a confluence of circumstances that really just makes it politically difficult to solve the problem. But those are the realities of education on Guam. For me, when I try to address that, I always go back to our local leadership and I say, you guys, we need our island and our leadership to build public credibility. We need to show the public the resources we're bringing in are in fact resulting in the outcomes that they're expecting. Then we can go back and ask for more resources, continue to deliver more outcomes, and eventually pull ourselves out of this, this trap. And so it's a leadership issue, it's an outcome issue, it's a funding issue, it's a parental involvement issue, and all of it comes together to either make an education system succeed or fail. And right now, Guam is struggling with that.
Okay, great. And I think we might only have time for one more question. What are your thoughts on the recent attacks on elderly Asian Americans in the past few weeks? And do you think there needs to be more legislation in place? And just your opinion, and what ways do you think that people from different backgrounds can help with raising awareness or with the legislative issues to do with the hate crime attacks in the past few weeks?
That's a very good question. It's also a very difficult question because, I really don't believe that you can legislate hate away. You can't pass a law to make people stop hating. And so we can absolutely explore whether or not consequences are robust enough, whether or not law enforcement has the resources to be able to police better, whether or not those who suffer from those kind of mistreatments have proper channels to be able to get help, even, particularly before things escalate into something very, very bad. But legislating hate away is just something I have a difficult time really trying to figure out how to do that. I think what we're dealing with in that circumstance and in every hate circumstance is we just really need to of the realities of how interdependent we are. We need the country to speak more. We need the media to speak more. We need to showcase more how all our different ethnic groups are major contributors to the success of this country, to what makes this country, shine as diverse as we are. Because when we break that hate down, I mean, hate starts in the home, really. And the only way that we can break that down is if everything outside of the home is really counter messaging that. And so, we need to elevate more ethnic success. We need to elevate more stories of how, the diversity of our community creates positive outcomes for everyone in the country. And I think that doing that is a community effort. I really have a difficult time imagining how to legislate that. And it happens in so many ways that aren't really direct to the issue, but they actually address the issue. Like, for example, how we're having more diverse Disney movies coming out. You know, those kind of things really begin to show the children and show the families and show the homes. There's heroes everywhere, and there's goodness everywhere. And we just need to elevate that message more. And I would absolutely support any legislation to do that. Maybe more resources to those kind of things, like diversity messaging, in media or incentives for those kind of things. I think would be very, very positive, as well as, of course, exploring the consequences for hate-based aggression. I think is something else, but it cannot just be a consequence-driven thing. It needs to be both carrot and stick if we're going to really overcome this.
Great, thank you. And I know we're closing in, but I'd love to ask one more, and you can answer it as briefly as you need to. But you mentioned earlier there were similarities between Guam and rural areas in the mainland. Many mainland rural areas that lack access to broadband rely on the U.S. Postal Service for medications, bills, and so forth. And they're going to be negatively impacted by the recently announced USPS Reconstruction proposals. Could you talk about how some of those recent proposals could impact Guam?
Well, I mean, it's pretty dramatic. On Guam, we are heavily dependent on the United States Postal Service for a variety of reasons. One, we don't have the same delivery infrastructure that you have out here in the States. Like, I can't order from Amazon and an Amazon truck is going to pull up. We don't have that on Guam. And that's, rural communities and their ability to be able to access goods is also similar to Guam's because they have the same limitations. FedEx and UPS and what's the other one? There's another one. Those delivery services, I mean, they're just so pricey. So we depend heavily on the Postal Service, and in our rural communities, and I'm sure, in Guam, and I'm sure in our rural communities with this COVID-19 set of circumstances, we have lines wrapped around the building on Guam at the post office. People standing for 3-4 hours trying to get their order, because if you order from Amazon, it comes in the mail on Guam. And one of the other challenges we have is because we're outside the U.S. customs zones, many places do not ship to Guam, and the only way that we really receive goods is from the Postal Service. So we can absolutely to the need for the Postal Service to be a very, very fluid conduit for goods to be able to reach consumers. That being said, we need to make sure that policy coming out in the country is not going to inhibit the ability for the Postal Service to do what they do. We actually need to be opening that up more. We need to be providing more resources. I had a really great conversation with a colleague of mine, very, very senior member of Congress. I won't say who he is because, I didn't get his permission to, but he's actually on the, I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, and he told me, he goes, what we're doing to this Postal Service is just absolutely atrocious. And he told me that, it actually started when we made the mistake of removing the Postal Office as a specific subcommittee in the Congress. They used to have direct congressional attention, and even now in the Congress, that's no longer the case. And so we need to revisit all of that. We need to look at how we can enhance the Postal Service and make it more effective, not less. There are many members of Congress who are deeply troubled by the direction of things in terms of the postal offices looking like they're going to be less effective, not more effective. And there will absolutely be legislation forthcoming to remedy that if it does not reverse itself on its present course. I guess I'll give you guys a little heads up on some legislation. I'm working on a bill to require the post offices to create a special line for people with disabilities and for senior citizens. I'm amazed that I have constituents standing in line for 4 hours, and among them are people with disabilities and senior citizens. I mean, that's just absolutely, how is that the case in America today? So we're working on that legislation. We're hoping to be able to move that out shortly. Of course, we're going to get the pushback of, this is going to take money, and I'm like, no, you can just put a piece of tape on the ground and tell people to line up there and prioritize them. But we'll get all the logistics figured out on that end. But there's absolutely going to be attention from the Congress now and ongoing to make sure postal service access is going to be something that's enhanced.
The camera's off. With the representative from Guam,
Sorry.
speaking to our law school.
Sorry, also.
And he was saying that
Sorry,
it's
so
ridiculous
can
that there's not a line for
Audio.
handicapped
Your
access because
volume is on.
postal service in Guam because people are.
Okay.
I muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm also not. I have time if we want to continue, unless you guys are all operating on a hard stop.
Oh, we thought that you were ending at 1 p.m. If you do have more time, we do have 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, no, I set aside my time for you guys here today, so we can keep going if you'd like.
Okay, great. So we can follow up with a question. Thank you for that insight. I had no idea, especially that Guam was dealing with that. Another question that we wanted to ask is, what do you think is the biggest misconception about working in Congress is? I know there's a lot of media portrayal of Congress members, but what do you think is a big misconception?
I think that there's and this I think goes back to education, there's a lack of understanding of the legislative process. I think that there's a general thought out there in the public that things can easily be done, that problems can easily be solved, and it gets a lot more complicated than that. And the politicians don't help that. I mean, there's just a lot of political sniping going on, and so when when a bill is introduced to do something, and the opponents to that bill, whether it's Democrat or Republican, get up and begin pointing out the shortfalls of it, rather than looking at it as a means to move forward. It just degrades public confidence in the legislative process, and that degradation has a compounded effect, because the less people believe that we can make change happen, the more intense the expectations become for change to happen rapidly, and the inability for that to happen due to the way the legislative process actually is only just exacerbates that frustration. So we're kind of eating onto ourselves in the way we over politicize things, and we don't focus on how something is actually making something better. And so I think that's a big misperception out there, is that the political environment is just so confrontational that we're constantly making it look like we're not doing things, even when we're doing so many things. And in doing that, we're creating the public perception that somehow it should be easier, when the legislative process is just not that simple either. That I think is one misperception that's out there. Another one is, I know that there's this whole liberal conservative point of view, but there's a big middle ground. There's a big middle ground from the extremes among members of Congress, and I really think in the country. I really think that not only are we a middle class country in terms of, or not only should we focus on growing our middle class in terms of economics, but we need to also realize that there is a lot of a lot of value to be gained in moderate perspective, or at least being able to respect moderate perspective. There's too much polarization. It's almost impossible to feel one way about one issue and one way about another issue if they don't firmly align on the far left or right of both issues. And what that does is it creates even more political gridlock, and political gridlock is absolutely not what the country wants. The more we can understand that our differences are what makes us who we are, but it's our similarities that are going to make us all eventually, move up together, and then begin focusing on that, improving the messaging on that, and working towards progress, and just trying to reassure everyone that we can build on progress, I think is something that we need to really be focusing on. And that's a really big misperception right now. High expectations, poor outcomes, perceptually poor outcomes, and just a spiral of frustration is unfortunately the political formula of the day.
Thank you, and we appreciate you going past one, so we'll just keep you with one more question. But we know that people of Guam are undoubtedly very patriotic. One article spoke about how Guam has one of the highest concentrations of veterans among the U.S. states and territories. Please provide any news on congressional initiatives or support specifically for veterans or the Veterans Administration.
Well, on Guam, we actually have some of the highest enlistment rates in the country for all of our armed services, and everyone's very, very patriotic. We do have a very, very large veteran community. One of the things, and this is another misperception when it comes to veteran policy, is that many people don't realize that we have a defense budget and then we have a veterans budget, and both are completely separate. We're so quick to fund defense, which of course, I don't have any problem with. I think that protecting the country is important. But the fact that we do not include veterans in the defense budget means that they're fighting for resources in a way that they never had to before when they were active duty. We can absolutely find the funding for the latest and greatest military hardware, or to fund any kind of actions to protect our national security interests. But all of a sudden, the funding for veterans is an entirely separate conversation. One of the first things I did when I came in was I brought up the question. I said, hey, why don't we just lump the veterans budget into the national defense budget and completely just address veterans the way we address active duty? Then both sides of the aisle will stop fighting over, over money for, the money for veterans would no longer be a shortcoming, because everyone will be falling all over themselves as it would be part of the defense budget. So, but unfortunately, again, political realities, right? Because it has a separate budget, it also has a separate focus, and that allows for politicians to talk about veterans in a separate way, as opposed to in a greater national defense conversation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does create a challenge when it comes to the allocation of resources. And in the end, that's the most important, most pressing thing that veterans across the country, not just in Guam, are just so frustrated about. There's just not enough resources for our veterans. We can find resources for military hardware and for military purposes, but we just have a difficult time getting additional resources for our veterans. And so I think that the future of veterans policy should continue to push more into the realm of the fact that a veteran is not someone outside of the military. A veteran is somebody inside of the military. And if we're going to be funding our military so consistently, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act that funds the military, passes every year. It's actually one of the most guaranteed bills to pass. Many members of Congress fall all over themselves trying to get amendments into the NDAA because it's the one thing that always gets bipartisan support. put our veterans in there. Let's get them the resources that they need. It's, I don't think that, the grander scheme of things, it probably would be more politically challenging, but I think that would be a very quick way for us to pump resources into our veterans. As for what they need, I think anybody here who knows a veteran or is a veteran can speak to that. Just access to services. In the rural communities in particular, it's much harder to get access to a veterans hospital. We do not have a veterans hospital on Guam. We are in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles away. We can't get a veterans hospital. You got to fly to Hawaii in order to get veteran hospital care. And so our rural areas, we rely on CBOCs, community-based outpatient clinics, and their service levels are just not at the level of a hospital. And so we do have some improvements. I think that the Congress recently, by further expanding veterans to be able to go out and get additional help from service providers based on their choice programs, I think is a good thing. But we really need to beef up access to care, access to services. One of the frustrating things on Guam is that because we don't have the physical service being provided, a lot of it's being provided via telehealth, and those are great. But I think we can all agree that if we were all sitting in a room right now, this experience will be just so much more profound. And when you're talking about a veteran who has PTSD or who needs some kind of psychiatric care, telehealth is better than nothing, but it's absolutely not the same as them being able to get face-to-face help. So we need to expand veterans care in that way. We need to be able to provide the resources for them. I'm totally open to, the radical idea, even though I don't think it should be, that veterans should be a part of the National Defense Authorization Act and fully fund it. Let's make sure that we take care of our soldiers, not just when they're active, but after they've served. I think that also should be, a staple of our American policy, and I absolutely support that.
Thank you so much. I know we're a little over and people might have class and so forth in meetings, but I just wanted to thank you all for coming and sending your great questions, and it's really facilitated a good conversation. And most importantly, to Congressman San Nicolas for taking his time out. I know that it's busy schedule and everything, so we really appreciate the fact that you're able to share your insights and so forth with us, as well as if you could thank Elidio on our behalf. And we want to thank Ermin Pablo, our 1L rep, for graciously spearheading this event. And I know some people in the comments are thanking you as well. And we have our Dean Butts, she's our diversity leader. She's raising her hand, so I'm just going to go ahead and let her speak really quickly as well.
Aloha. I'm actually originally from Hawaii, but I did live on Guam for 1 year, and
Awesome.
I attended Simon Sanchez. What high school did you go to?
I actually, well, first of all, I taught at Simon Sanchez for a semester. My parents being educators, they're like, oh, try education. And I tried it, and my goodness, to be an educator, that is a special calling. It's not just something that anybody can do, and I will absolutely attest to that. But so I went to actually 3 different high schools. When I was in my undergrad, when I was not in high school, I went to public school for my elementary and middle school years, and so I wanted to try private school for high school. So I went to FD for 1 year, and I liked it. I enjoyed it. It was an experience going to private school. And then my dad, who was a school administrator, he got transferred to JFK, which is the northern high school, and so I wanted to try public high schools. Being a public school student, I said, let me see what I'm missing out on. So I went up to JFK with him, and that was great. I actually, that was where I met my wife. We were students in the same school. I had the biggest crush on her, but her best friend liked me. And so you know how that all works out, right? We eventually met up in college afterwards, and we've been together for going on 16 years now. So after JFK, my dad got transferred to another school. And so I said, let me go back to FD, and, because, I came from there, but I played sports in JFK, and, sports very competitive on Guam. I played basketball, and we beat FD when I was at JFK. And so I got branded as a traitor. And so when I went back to FD, I was targeted. they came after me, and so I was like, oh wow, what an experience. And then Southern High was opening up in 1998, the new Southern High School. It was a brand new school going up, and so I said, let me check it out. You know, new school. I'm from the South. I've never been to a Southern High School before, so I went down there. First graduating class of Southern High School, class of 1998, and that was where I actually I played sports for my first 3 years. I actually got into mock trial, and I got into forensics, and that was where I really found myself on the extracurricular side. That I had a penchant for public speaking and for communicating, and also for arguing, and so that was the most important experience that ultimately contributed to me being here today. Just kind of finding myself in that mock trial forensics experience, learning how to articulate a thought and put together a coherent argument. That was priceless. So yeah, those 3 high schools, it was for a variety of reasons, but God in his providence kind of knows what he's doing when he sends you places and makes you experience things. So I think it turned out pretty okay.
It sounds like it did. You met your wife, and now you're here representing Guam. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much too, and it was a real pleasure. Herman, Nasim, Nikita, thank you all very much, and to everybody for making time today. I really enjoy being able to share perspective, and this was absolutely enjoyable for me as well. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.